¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a todos a este podcast de Heads Up. Es un podcast de EY México, donde tratamos temas de las tendencias globales más importantes. Hablamos temas de negocios y hoy en día tenemos con nosotros a Mathew Bell, que es nuestro líder global de cambio climático y sostenibilidad, nuestra práctica bien conocida como CICAS o Climate Change and Sustainability Services. Muchas gracias, Matt, por acompañarnos hoy. Matt tiene más de 20 años trabajando en temas de sostenibilidad. Él dirige un equipo global de más o menos 4,000 profesionales trabajando mañana, tarde y noche en temas de sostenibilidad. Tiene además un doctorado en biotecnología. Sí. Y está con nosotros para tratar temas alrededor de las tendencias más importantes en materia de sostenibilidad alrededor del mundo. Thank you, Matt, for being here. So we have a couple of questions for you. You can answer the questions or you can say whatever you want. But first of all, let us think about, when we're discussing about sustainability and when we are reimagining the world and the new economy. So what does that really mean, right, in terms of, what does companies have to do for a more sustainable businesses? And we understand that it requires a full transformation. So can you tell us a little bit what you have seen in terms of the, more global scenarios, and then if you can also link it to Latin America somehow? Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to be here. We should probably start by going right back to the basics, which is, what is sustainability? I mean, fundamentally, and I think it's worth trying to articulate what sustainability is, because over the last 3 or so years, as you know, Ruth, it has become incredibly popular, and everybody talks about becoming more sustainable or less impactful. But sustainability really, I think, comes back to the 1980s Brundtland Report on Sustainable Development, which is really to meet the needs of people today without compromising the needs of people into the future. And I think when we start to think about that, we have to question if there are any organizations that exist today that are genuinely sustainable, that they give back more to society and nature than they take. And the answer, sadly, is no.
No.
Right? There aren't actually any sustainable organizations on Earth. There are organizations that are less impactful to the environment than some of their competitors, maybe those that do more for society. But truthfully, the term sustainability is an endpoint. It's a goal. And when we look at what we face today, we have a rise in technological development. We have a political environment that is changing.
Right.
We have nationalism. We have organizations needing to deal with complexity internationally and domestically on legislation, on customer and consumer behaviors. And so thinking through what that means really is, how do we take organizations from this, what we are calling a polycrisis environment, where economic, environmental and social pressures are causing collapses, to a position where organizations are actually regenerative.
Right.
They give back more than they consume. We actually have been doing quite a bit of work over the last few years with a research group that actually, Ruth, you and I helped to found, which is the New Economy Unit. And the New Economy Unit really started to wrestle with that concept. What are the principles that are driving the polycrisis? And what would need to be the principles to drive a regenerative economy? And really, at the highest level, they're obvious, because when you look at the evidence, you can start to see what would need to be done. We need to move away from linear business models of take, make, and consume to ones that are much more circular. We need to move away from a complete focus on financial performance and take a broader view of value. And when we start to take some of those principles into consideration, you're really talking about a transformation that you mentioned, necessary for all companies to, truthfully, exist within planetary limits.
Right, and then you have touched upon a point that I think is very important, because we're often, have this, dual discussion with, short-term revenue and meeting the targets of the companies in terms of financial stability, but then that is compromising the long term sometimes. So how can you really have that conversation where you need to look at the long term, even if you sacrifice your short term next quarter results, right?
Yeah.
So how do you really engage these conversations with the clients and with the CFO?
It's a real challenge. Actually, a year ago, we undertook a survey in EY of 2,500 CFOs, and we asked them the questions of what they thought their biggest priorities would be for the coming year, the year that we're in at the moment. And for over 90%, either number one or two in their priorities was addressing sustainability, which is great.
Great.
But on the flip side, and to your point, the second question we asked was, if there was economic pressure on the business, what are the first things that you would stop funding? And unfortunately, number one or number two was also sustainability. And so we have this challenge where there is a real recognition that organizations have to be steered for the long term if they're going to continue to exist.
Right.
But if certain stakeholders require them to make decisions that benefit them in the short term at the expense of the long, that's where we have our breakdown. And that's ultimately the challenge that we face with sustainability.
Right.
Now, one of the factors that leads to that, as you know, Ruth, is that many of the consequences that need to be dealt with aren't priced into business.
Exactly.
They're externalities.
Right.
Whether that's the full price of water, the impact of labor that is undocumented or forms of modern slavery, it's the impacts of producing greenhouse gas emissions that impact on climate change. Very few of those fall within the P&L of a company today. And so we actually need, I think, to work with business leaders to understand how they can better inform their stakeholders, and particularly investors,
right,
that the decisions that they're making, which might be seen to be impacting short-termism, is actually making them a very strong business that will persist over time.
Right, and that's exactly, I think, the conversation. But Matt, tell me a little bit about regulations. So we had CSRD coming out very strong, let's say last year before, and we have Omnibus this year. Also, many other regulations really going forward, and as it is in Latin America, Mexico, and Brazil for ISSB. So what is also the reading of these regulations and more so like the geopolitical environment for sustainability?
Well, I think we need to probably look, you can look at it two ways. You can look in a very small way at what's happening at the moment, which is, I think, a kind of a reset on where the regulatory environment has been going. But I think you also need to step back and look at the overall picture. We have seen a significant shift at the national and the international level around commitments and regulations towards improving our impacts on the environment and improving life for society at large. In Europe, you could argue they have been leading this through their green transformation over the last few years. CSRD, or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is obviously the most famous of those, because it impacted 7,000 companies last year who had to do more comprehensive sustainability disclosures than we've ever seen. But actually, that's not the only legislation. We've seen anti-deforestation legislation, which is coming into place. We will have, from next year, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is going to require every one of those companies to assess their tier one suppliers to ensure that they aren't breaching human rights and that they're remaining environmentally compliant.
And that's going to reach probably every other company around the world.
I think that's right. Yes, every single one of their business operations and their tier one suppliers is just a huge network. And I think that has a ripple effect to suppliers of those suppliers down through the supply chain. But nonetheless, we have seen pressure economically and nationalization of policies that's been driving competitiveness at a country level that is pushing back on some of the expansion in the green policies. We've also seen a pushback on legislation towards things like artificial intelligence. And we've had leading governments like here in Mexico where we have seen the 2018 AI acts that have come in, and those in Europe. And in other countries, they have deemed not to try and put controls whilst they try and drive for economic progress. And whether you think about this in terms of technology or you think about it in terms of the environment, the challenges are the same. How do we maintain progress and support an increasing way of life where we have greater levels of abundance? But how do we do that in a way which protects future generations? So the truth today is we will see more regulation next year than we have had last year, despite the noise.
Despite the noise, yeah.
But I think the reality is also, I think organizations need to think about their compliance, sure, but take a wider view of what's important to their business from a sustainability context.
Yeah, and actually take compliance as a way to understand their businesses and to really, deep dive into like the main risks, opportunities, trying to understand better the organization. And that's what we have been seeing a lot. We have had, I really don't know how many clients calls, because they really want to understand the regulation here in Mexico. So, it's now mandatory for all the public companies to report on their ISSB S1 and S2 starting January 1st, 2025. Yeah. And that's a large number of companies, but also it's entire programs that you have to develop for these companies because it's extensive what we're asking. So if you take that as an opportunity to really look into your organization, I think that's where all the benefits and the value added is gonna come from, not only from the compliance side but also for understanding your company. But
we know that's true though. I mean, if we think about some of the work we've been doing, Ruth, over the years with something like TCFD,
right?
So Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which was voluntary and actually established by the now Prime Minister of Canada,
right.
But what we saw with that was it was the first time that all of the business leaders within an organization had to come together to discuss climate change and its consequences. And I can't give you the names of all of the companies that we went to where it was this profound experience where the CFO suddenly understood there was financial risk associated with climate change. That the chief risk officer, who had nothing in his risk register on climate change, suddenly saw catastrophic risks across their supply chain, or the procurement officer who had to change their supply chain dynamics. And so we will see exactly the same thing with ISSB, we will see exactly the same thing with CSRD, and I think maybe more profoundly, because to your point, when you undertake that first piece of work, you need to determine what's most material.
Right.
And when you've done that analysis, and when you do that materiality analysis well, it is like a window to your organizational strategy. It shows you where your business could go well or go wrong into the future.
Right. And that you have not really assessed the risk. So, they're right there now with the materiality assessment. No, correct. So let me ask you a question around COP. So we have COP 30 coming up in Brazil this year. There's lots of conversations around it, private sector, public policy. But what do you think that we should expect from this, global reunion that is going to be happening at the end of the year?
Yeah, well, we can look at it from the perspective of governments and we could look at it from the perspective of business. Mm-hmm. Let's start with governments because ultimately that's what the process of the Conference of Parties or the COP was about.
COP, correct.
It was the bringing together of nations through the United Nations who were signatories to try and do something about climate change.
Right.
Now, what's most important for COP 30 in Belém is that all of the countries who are signatories to Paris, when we had the agreement in 2015, need to set out what their national plans are to reduce emissions for this time, 2035. So this is the next stage, 2035 targets.
Right.
Now, we've only got a few countries that have done that already, including the UK, where I'm based. We're in discussion at the moment with Mexico, producing their NDC and the complexity around that. But ultimately, what would usually happen is governments would come together, they would present their NDCs, they would negotiate some of the articles, and everybody would go back to their countries very happy with themselves that they'd had an agreement at the COP. Mm-hmm. What we've seen with the COP processes, though, is that despite international agreement, the reality of climate change is it's got worse. Emissions have continued to rise.
Right.
We need to halve emissions in the next 5 years and to completely decarbonize in or around the mid-century, and we are way off track.
Way off track.
And we knew from COP29, when the UN produced its report, that we're heading for somewhere between 2.7 to 3.2 degrees of warming. I mean, catastrophic climate change. So what does that mean then for business if we come back? Well, I think it's an opportunity, actually. Because if you start to think of the NDCs not as a government commitment to nations to play their part, but a strategic plan on the regulatory and supporting environment that helps business to meet that objective, suddenly it's no longer a government objective, it's a business opportunity through transformation.
Right.
And as we know, transformation leads to opportunity. So I am really hopeful that in Belém, what we will see actually is greater engagement with the private sector at the national level to transfer those NDCs into credible plans where businesses can play their part. And that they can set out for the governments what would need to be true to have that.
Right.
You know, is that tax policy? Is that incentives? Is it regulation? You know, is it trade policy? Who knows? But I think it's those kind of conversations that have been missing for a long time that we'll need to see at this COP.
Hopefully, Matt, we will discuss more, after COP. But do you have any final remark in terms of, our position in Latin America, the opportunities, and really, the businesses, but also the governments, and how can we be seen as a region that can move ahead in terms of, setting up some examples for other parts of the region as well?
I would, in my view, I think Latin America has the most to gain and the most to lose from our whole sustainability conversation.
Right.
I mean, South America it's the lungs of the world.
Right.
The Amazon rainforest, contributes, greater biodiversity outcomes than almost the rest of the forests in the world combined. And we have access to and we have responsibility for some of the greatest natural resources the world has here in this region.
Right.
So we have a lot to lose if this goes wrong, and it isn't all up to us.
Right.
If the rest of the world don't get on board, we still get impacted here in Latin America. At the same time, many countries within Central and Southern America are going through rapid development.
Okay.
At a time when we are going through rapid transformation. And so in many ways, Latin America has the ability to capitalize on the new economy in a way that Europe and North America can't. There is so much incumbency in Europe and in North America that Latin America doesn't have. And where we've seen that play out today is China. So China is now leading in many respects on the new green economy. It still has a long way to go in the context of its own greenhouse gas emissions. It's a huge emitter, number 2 behind the US.
Yes.
But it is now the largest producer and developer of electric vehicles, the largest producer and developer and exporter of renewable energy technologies, the largest deployment of renewables in country. It has the largest emissions trading scheme by volume. And so China, because of its rapid development as a developing country, has been able to see where they think the future is going and make the right investments. Latin America has the same opportunity. And so I think it needs to see things like COP16, which we had earlier in Cali, Colombia, on nature, and COP30 that we're going to have here in Belém on climate change, as an opportunity for this region to tell the world what it needs and what it's going to lead.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us in this podcast. It's very nice to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks.